Hey everybody, Dr. Nick Thomas here. Just finished recording a session with Laura Powell, a veteran travel writer and journalist. Laura is currently the luxury and wellness correspondent for Skift. During our conversation, we covered a wide variety of issues, including her career path, trends, how she decides what to write for her articles, and some of the things she's most excited about in the travel industry. I hope you enjoy the episode. Good afternoon, everybody. This is Dr. Nicholas Thomas recording live at the corner of State and Jackson. As always, you are tuned into the Hospitality Spirit podcast. Thanks so much for listening. If you've been enjoying these episodes, I encourage you to share, like, subscribe, all of the above. Today, I am joined by a good friend, great supporter of DePaul School of Hospitality Leadership, Laura Powell. Laura is a veteran travel journalist. She is the luxury and wellness correspondent for Skift. So much to talk about today, Laura, but thank you so much for being here.
It's my pleasure.
As I said, there's a lot of stuff that we could cover, but I think let's go ahead and set the stage for the audience on what you're now doing currently. We can talk a little bit about how you got there in a moment, but let's just set the stage where you are currently right now in your career.
Well, where I am in my career is several decades in, and I am still a freelancer. I've been freelance actually for more than 20 years. My main outlet right now is Skift, which is, I think, the premier outlet for covering the business of travel, talks about travel trends and what's new in the business. I cover specifically luxury and wellness for them, but I also do your occasional top 10 list for Orbitz or Sherman's Travel, sometimes appear on TV, do different odds and ends as well, but mainly covering luxury and wellness right now.
How did you get into this? I mean, I know your background, but for those people that are listening, how did you really kind of come to be at this place in your career? Is it that you had a passion for travel and tourism? Is it you had a passion for writing? And those kind of merged? How did you end up where you are today?
Well, I think I always had a passion for travel. My first trip to Europe was when I was 7 years old, and I was actually out of school for 4 months while my family traveled around Europe. So that was my first exposure to travel, so I guess it kind of was bred in me early. But when I went to college, I wanted to be a broadcaster, and I wanted to be a sports broadcaster. But this was back in the day when women were not really welcomed into the field of sportscasting. So when I graduated from college, I went to CNN to produce and write news, which I had never really intended to be a news reporter per se, but I was doing TV. And then a couple years on, I went to grad school, went to grad school overseas, so traveled during that year extensively, came back to CNN, and they were starting up a travel show. And so I thought, well, that would be interesting. And so I applied for the gig, got it, produced the travel show, covered travel for CNN for 5 years, and then went freelance, where I have been ever since.
That's interesting, because this was in an era where travel shows on CNN. I mean, CNN was a news network.
Yeah, and at the time, CNN did have some feature shows. It wasn't opinion and this kind of thing. It wasn't all politics all the time. It was features as well as news.
That must have been fascinating to be doing a travel show like that. I mean, I've always lived vicariously through various travel. I mean, I still think to this day, and I still get choked up when I think about Anthony Bourdain and kind of how he revolutionized what we think of as the modern day travel show. But so many of us now see that just as a standard aspect of television. I mean, we as faculty here in the school, we use those travel shows as part of the learning experience. We use them to inspire students on what their career and what they can do. And international was such a big part of what we do here in the school. And that's just so cool that you got to do that.
Well, you would think so. But let me tell you, I actually produced a travel show with absolutely no travel budget. So I basically sat in my office in Atlanta begging people for video, because back then, this was before cell phones and all the small cameras existed, most travel industry companies did not have video. So it was not as glamorous as it sounded, but that said, I did catch the travel journalism bug. And when I did leave CNN, realizing that there was this need among travel industry players, hotel companies, travel associations to get video, I started a video production company that specialized in travel. So I worked for all sorts of places like the American Hotel and Lodging Association, the World Travel and Tourism Council, a lot of the different hotel companies, helping them to put together both B-roll and then various other odds and ends when it came to video, in addition to doing the journalism work.
And then, so then you kind of found that writing as opposed to TV was your preferred medium, or?
No, it just kind of has evolved that way, mainly because there aren't that many jobs in television in travel, and there are more opportunities in print. So I still appear on television to talk about travel as a guest travel expert, but in terms of paying jobs, nobody really has a travel reporter on staff. So it's just the opportunities have led me more in the direction of writing. So right now you're working on. We kind of talked about the luxury wellness side of things. Did you naturally gravitate towards that side of travel writing, or is that something where you saw that there was a need, or that was kind of a trend that was evolving? Well, with the luxury, basically, Skift was advertising for a luxury correspondent. And while in many jobs, in many situations in travel, experience really doesn't matter, I was happy that Skift actually appreciated the fact that I had a long time relationship with the travel industry and understood it very well. So I applied for the job with luxury and got that. And then I've never considered myself a luxury traveler, although when you are a travel writer, you do find yourself traveling to places that normally you would never be able to, afford yourself, because you do have discounts and press trips and this kind of thing. But the wellness actually is something I've always been interested in, and I've always covered it to some degree. And then when Skift wanted to add wellness coverage to its bailiwick, I was brought in to help with that as well.
So I read the Great Skift report on wellness and kind of the trends that are heading in that direction that just came out this month, October 2019. But for those people that are listening right now, could you just give a little bit of an overview of what you mean when you say wellness? Travel, wellness, tourism. I know the report talked about the difference between them, but for the common listener right now that's hearing this and has never heard this term before, what does that mean?
Well, I think the first distinction to make is between wellness tourism and medical tourism. So with wellness tourism, you're going somewhere because you want to feel better, or you want to, relax, or you just want to de-stress. Whereas with medical tourism, which could be considered wellness, but medical is you're actually going somewhere for a cure, to get surgery, or even to get plastic surgery to cure your wrinkles. But
sure. So like when I lived in Asia, I would go up to Bumrungrad in Thailand.
Right.
And because the hospital was fantastic and there was nothing like it in the region, and you'd see people there from 50 different countries all there for the exact same checkup.
And that's a big business, but that's not what we cover. So wellness is more the experience of, traditionally it's been going to the spa, going to a yoga retreat, but that definition has really expanded over the years to include more of, taking in nature and interacting with people and things that make you feel good, not only from a physical perspective, but from a mental perspective as well.
And this is not a concept that's unique to the United States. This is truly a global concept. Where are some of the destinations right now that are really embracing this as a driver of tourism for their market?
Well, it's interesting because there are a few different countries who are doing some interesting things. Japan has certainly taken advantage of this phenomenon of forest bathing, which kind of got its start in Japan, where people are taken into the woods on a guided kind of walk meditation where you go into the woods, you're embraced by nature, you're smelling the smells and hearing the sounds, and it's a way for Japan, and in fact any other country or place that chooses to adopt it, it's a way for them to get visitors out of crowded urban areas and into the hinterlands, which may not otherwise have an opportunity to attract tourists. So it's really smart, that idea of using nature as a tourism asset. So in Japan, forest bathing is very popular. China, of course, is just expanding like crazy, just all across the board. There's a great interest in wellness tourism there, particularly because more and more women are now able to afford traveling on their own as the middle class grows there. And then a country like Slovenia, which is actually focusing more on the green tourism aspect, but that idea of nature, of being able to go for a hike, as well as going to the lake, experiencing thermal springs and this kind of thing. Switzerland as well is also really targeting the nature traveler.
So my perception is an interest in this has always existed, this style of travel. It's just, is it more the current generation of traveler is now looking for this? Are people just looking to diversify their offerings in their respective tourism markets?
Well, you've got to remember things like thermal bathing go back centuries, right? I mean, it's been done for hundreds and hundreds of years in Japan, in Eastern Europe, and even in the United States. Some of our founding fathers like to hang out in hot springs. So it's certainly not new, but I think a lot of things are being rediscovered. I think that for a long time, some aspects of wellness travel were considered woo-woo. You know, it's like, oh, you're going on a trip to, go meditate. How odd. Whereas now those kind of practices are becoming more mainstream, not just for traveling, but in people's everyday lifestyle. And so as people have more of those wellness opportunities in their own everyday life, they want to continue those practices when they travel.
Is wellness travel something that is synonymous with luxury travel, or is this can be an affordable option for people? It
can be affordable because, again, and this is where I think, especially when you're looking at natural kinds of wellness, you go for a hike and you're out in nature for a few hours, you're going to feel better and it doesn't cost you a thing. And again, I think that there are more and more facilities that are kind of setting up glamping resorts, which, I mean, glamping indicates it's luxury, but it's still camping, right? So you're out in nature, you're camping or glamping, and then you might have a yoga retreat or something like that. So yes, it's associated with luxury because the old school style of wellness, that idea of going to Canyon Ranch or Miraval, which cost thousands and thousands of dollars for a week, used to be the only way to have wellness accessible to you as a traveler. But now there are options across the budget ranges.
Is there a state or a collection of states here in the U.S. that's really embracing this? I mean, you talked about Slovenia, China, Japan. What about here domestically in the U.S.? Is there a state that's really embracing this concept?
Well, I mean, I think like California has always kind of been considered the wellness capital of the U.S. Certainly, they've been very far ahead in bringing certain modalities into the mainstream and that kind of thing. Arizona as well, where you see a lot of spas. Colorado has been doing some interesting things lately, again, more around the natural assets it has. It, about 5 years ago, developed a hot springs trail, which is a 720-mile loop in the western part of the state that connects 5 different communities that have hot springs. So they've discovered that in creating this loop and creating a map that includes stops along the way, that every community along the way and the 5 main communities all have experienced increases in tourism year over year. So again, they're just kind of looking at what they already have and building around it.
And these aren't necessarily small, independent, family-owned, operated businesses. I mean, large companies like, you mentioned Miraval. Clearly Hyatt is involved in that now. So the big players in the industry are seeing that this is I don't want to use the word sustainable. It's kind of cliche when we're talking about wellness, but this is for the foreseeable future, this trend is going to continue.
Yeah,
like.
and Westin is trying to position itself. I mean, it has previously positioned itself, but now more so as kind of the wellness brand within the Marriott family. I think the important thing, though, is that similar to when the environmental movement started and everyone was claiming that they were green because they didn't wash your sheets, a lot of places are claiming to be wellness oriented when really all they offer is maybe a salad on their menu, or they put a yoga mat in the room. So I would say to any hotel company that is trying to ride the wellness bandwagon that it's really important to actually walk the walk and not just talk the talk.
Well, it's funny you mentioned Westin, because I think about wellness, and your report talked about this. I mean, I remember the Heavenly Bed still to this day as one of the first examples of, okay, you can have this core hospitality concept, but having aspects of wellness incorporated into it, even just a really good night's sleep, healthy options. I saw an article recently that Hilton, maybe it was Hilton or another brand, was actually turning their rooms almost into like an aerobic studio where they put the exercise bike in the room. So it's interesting how just the hospitality product that we think is very traditional is diversifying and embracing this brand too.
Well, and sleep is actually a very important component of wellness that you would think that the hotels would have kind of caught up on sooner than now. But now it's kind of the new ground for competition, where it's not just about the mattress now. It's about blackout curtains, which you get a lot of times in other countries, but you don't get very often here. Circadian lighting, so that if you're trying to adapt to a new time zone, the lighting actually will help you do that. Aromatherapy showers and chromotherapy baths and all these different things that are really designed for the traveler to get a better night's sleep. And this is something I think almost every hotel company now is really starting to hone in on.
Well, it's not just hotels. I was fascinated to watch the coverage of the recent Qantas flight from New York to Sydney. And clearly there are flights that are almost as long. I mean, I remember one of my first times to Singapore, I flew the LA to Singapore nonstop. They're doing the San Francisco to Singapore. They're doing Newark to Singapore. So there are flights that are up in the 18, 19-hour range already. But it was fascinating to watch the recent coverage of this Qantas flight, because they were using the first flight almost as a flying test bed. And one of the things that they were doing is keeping the lights on and forcing people, almost mandating when people would sleep and not sleep, because on a flight of that magnitude, and I was explaining to a colleague that it's not just the 18 and a half hours on the flight, but it's, you got to get to the airport an hour or two early, and it's the hour or two after the flight. So these people are awake for 24 hours. So be able to manage that sleep effectively on a flight of that length. There's customer service issues. There's health and wellness issues. There's issues of loyalty and kind of brand recognition. I mean, there's so much involved in that. And not just hotels.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I know right now there's an app out that was designed by a NASA engineer, I believe, who a friend of mine just tried it out on a trip to Singapore. And she was saying it does exactly that. You put where you're coming from, where you're going, but it does. It forces you to stay awake. So if you board the plane at midnight and you're tired and you want to sleep, it will say, no, you can't go to sleep now. You have to wait for 6 hours. So whether that's actually going to work, because when somebody's tired, they're tired.
Sure,
theoretically, yes, if they pay attention, they won't have jet lag, but I think it's going to take a long time to convince people of that.
Well, and it even went so far as not just with the lighting, but the types of food they were offering, spicier food at the beginning to kind of keep people up and energized, and it's just fascinating to see. I'm curious, I think I've read the vast majority of everything that you've written in kind of preparation for this, and kind of since we've known each other. One of my favorite was the article about the steak knives.
Yes.
How, and maybe we can put a link to the steak knife article in the podcast description here. How do you decide what you're going to write about? And that's such a simple question, but I'm so curious.
Well, and sometimes it's really hard. There are certain weeks where I'm like, oh, what am I going to write about? I just have no ideas. I mean, a lot of times traveling itself will inspire me, obviously, when I see something in another country or another state that's interesting. I read a lot. I read about general trends. I like to look at like Inc. magazine and Fast Company. Right now, I'm working on a piece. There was a story a few weeks back that told about an Oxford University study that focused on cold and luxury and how people's perceptions of a luxury product are affected by temperature. And so I thought, well, how could that apply to travel? And so I talked to the researcher and I talked to a couple of luxury travel experts, and we will find out how it applies to travel in next week's in an upcoming Skift column.
Yeah, it's interesting because we know that ambient conditions in an environment. I mean, I came from the casino industry. I mean, we know this. We know what lighting, what sounds, what temperatures work and are going to keep people in the casino. We know what not to put on the walls, windows, clocks to keep people in places. I'm fascinated to read this article because and we talk about it in my customer service class. We talk about ambient conditions. So I'm fascinated to read this article.
Yeah.
So you essentially have empowerment to write something, and I would assume that you have kind of articles in your mental queue about long term, and some of them maybe take months and maybe even years to plan out and get the logistics together. Particularly if you see something on the horizon. Is that a pretty accurate assumption?
Well, because I try to write something every week, sometimes it is just a week-to-week situation. Sometimes the timing is very important. Sometimes the story might tie into a news event. Other times I might see something and file it away and say, okay, when I have time to pursue that, or when I find that I can find that a particular point is becoming a trend. So I like to do several interviews on a story, not just focus on one person and one company. So if I find an interesting company that's doing something with alternative accommodations, for example, like Canoe Bay, which is starting a tiny home resort in Canoe Bay, Wisconsin, then I want to find, well, what are some other companies doing? And so I found a company that's opening glamping sites in unusual places, and another that uses Airstreams as their alternative accommodations, and then another company in Australia that uses containers and tricks them out into luxury suites. So then I combine all of that into one story.
What advice would you give someone that's listening to this that says, I kind of want to do this. Like, this is what I want to do. I want to write about an industry that I'm super passionate about. If someone's listening to this, what sort of pointers would you give them and critical things that they should begin to focus on right now? And let's just say in general, it's someone that's in college right now. So they're in 18 to 22 years of age, but they know that this is what they might want to do.
Well, when everyone hears what my job is, they're like, I want your job. Huh? It sounds like the dream job, and for me it is. But it isn't for everyone in the sense that you are not likely to make a lot of money. So, I mean, if your prime motivator for a career is money, then being a travel writer isn't necessarily going to be for you. Now, I know that a lot of people coming out of college are seeing the dollar signs and the glamour that they perceive in this idea of being an influencer. But
what do you mean? I mean, what do you explain that a little bit? What do you mean by that?
Well, influencers are basically, it's something that's been evolving ever since first Twitter started and then Instagram. But basically, at this point, if somebody has enough followers, or if they micro-target a certain segment that is appealing to a company or a destination, then they are basically paid to promote products and destinations. So, there's a lot of fashion influencers, travel influencers, and that's fine. I think that it's going to shake out, and there's going to be some issues involved because there are ethics that people don't always disclose that they're being paid. But I just want to point out that that's not journalism.
And sometimes the industries, when I've talked to some industry people, they're somewhat skeptical and do the proverbial eye roll when they're like, that's not really necessarily the route that we want to go down. That's kind of the route that we've been forced to go down in some cases, is to have these influencers come in and promote our brand. It's just...
And yet there's no proof that there's any ROI. So I think there's starting to be pushback about it, particularly in travel, because with travel, you're already paying somebody thousands of dollars to get to your destination potentially. And a lot of times then that person's like, oh, can I bring my girlfriend, boyfriend? Can I bring my dog? Can I bring, So
can I bring my podcast editor along with me?
Come on along, everybody. So the point being that there's that whole Instagrammer thing, but that's not journalism. It's basically PR. It's basically advertising. If you're truly interested in the journalism side of things, then my advice would be approach travel as you would any other discipline that you specialize in, whether it's sports, whether it's the arts, whether it's news. But understand the industry that you're covering, because that's going to give you a huge leg up on the competition. I see so many travel writers out there who really don't understand the industry they're covering. So they're able to write about 10 great things to do when you're in London, but they're really not aware of what the larger trends are. For example, at Skift, we write a lot about this idea of over-tourism, right? That certain cities are really staggering under the weight of over-tourism, like Barcelona and Venice. And it's not only a matter of, there's so many tourists in those cities, but that the very fact that all these tourists go there mean that landlords, instead of renting their apartments to locals, rent them on Airbnb, which means all of a sudden there's a housing shortage in the city because everyone's renting their places out to tourists. So it has all these implications that go far beyond tourism to local quality of life and those kind of things. Anyway, that's a big macro issue that the majority of travel writers aren't really aware of. But if you're a travel journalist, it's something that it's really important to understand some of those underlying issues that affect the entire industry.
It's interesting, and I'm so glad to hear you say that, because one of the things I think through this podcast, we can come up with lots of themes and advice that we hear commonly. And one of the things that, regardless of who the guest is, whether they're from American Airlines, Expedia, Hyatt Hotels, there's the constant reinforcement of having to stay updated on trends and the news and current events. Skift is a great place for that, but there's also lots of other sources. Just having a sense of what is going on in terms of trends. How is climate change impacting Venice? It clearly is. How is overpopulation impacting things? How are trade wars or bad, we'll call them PR issues and challenges that a particular company might face because of behavior towards a guest or a customer? How do these things impact in the long run? Can be so useful in understanding. We send students out on study abroads all over the world, and am I looking at what's going on in Paris during World Cup? Am I looking at, this particular country is having this big global event or this political challenge right now? You have to be aware of those things to really fully be able to talk about those things, in your case, through the medium of journalism.
Absolutely. Certainly being up on the news, from the wildfires that in California and how the tourism industry out there is reacting to that, trade wars, policies. China, a lot of times, encourages or discourages travel from other countries depending on what their political situation is with those countries. A lot of people right now are we've been seeing a decrease in international tourists to the United States for the past few years. So politics definitely plays a role, and you can't just be in an echo chamber of travel. You really do need to be aware of what's going on in the world.
I think this is also where getting involved in associations and finding a mentor and networking. It's not just what you read, but it's also who you interact with on a daily basis. And many of these professional associations related to hospitality and tourism, current events and trends and what's going on, and that might be a local chapter of an association, that might be a national association, an international professional association, lots of different ways for you to start to understand that.
Right. And again, these conversations with people, this research all serve as influences for things you're going to write about. I mean, if I'm just sitting at my computer, I often cannot get inspiration just sitting behind my computer. Whereas if I'm getting out and interacting with professionals and talk to them about their challenges and what they see are the trends, then that can inspire coverage.
What's on your bucket list of where to go, what to do right now? I mean, you've done so much, you've traveled so many places, you write about this, you know it extremely well. But what are you seeing right now where you're like, I got to go either there for the first time or go back and experience?
Well, I hate that expression, and a lot of times
bucket list.
The list. We'll just say a list. But a lot of times places aren't necessarily on my radar. And then like Japan, I've written a lot about Japan this past year because with the Olympics coming up, the country is doing a lot to make itself more approachable by international travelers. There's a lot more English signage. They're having a lot more people in the countryside learn English. Also, they're, again, interested in dispersing visitors around the country because of the issues of over-tourism. So I was never particularly interested in going to Japan, but after writing several articles about Japan this year, I was like, oh, that would be interesting. And then an opportunity has come up to go there for a conference, and so it's like, okay, I'm going. So sometimes these things aren't necessarily on a list, but then the opportunity develops, and I'm like, oh, want to go there. That said, one place I would very much like to go to, and there is probably a sensitivity, an environmental sensitivity to going there, is Antarctica. There's always that real debate, and I did a story about it recently. I went to the Galapagos about 25 years ago, and back then, no ships were allowed that were more than like 12 people, and they really, really limited the numbers. And now, and there were no resorts or anything that were located on any of the Galapagos Islands, and now more hotel companies are, not many, not a lot, but enough, are starting to open on the Galapagos Islands, on places like Easter Island. And, it's always that debate about, well, if you go to those places, if you go to a place like Antarctica where that is so fragile, is tourism hurting or helping? So there is that kind of aspect in one's mind when one goes to those places. But on the other hand, I think Antarctica would be incredible, and the opportunity to educate people about what you see down there, about how climate change is affecting life down there, and getting to talk to the scientists and things. As a journalist, I think that would be an amazing story.
Well, and the people that I know that have gone down there, all of them went by ship. So some of the cruise operators went down there, and what they really liked about it is there was that educational component to it, and on the way down there was lecture series and talking about it, and your time was then limited to how much you could go on, and they really wanted to try to reduce the footprint, if you will, that they were there. So this idea that it is an educational experience. In a past life, I was involved in a Grand Canyon tour operator, and a lot of them was just get them to Vegas. How many people can we cram on this airplane? Fly them out there. They can see it. And there really wasn't. They were just kind of checking a box that they saw it and did it, but they didn't really care about the impact that they might have had. I remember there was always a joke that right outside one of the tour operators, when you got to one of the rims of the canyon, there was a McDonald's there, and it's just you kind of just sat there. You're like, okay,
really?
Well,
Yeah,
really? But nothing against McDonald's. It just didn't. It wasn't the. It just seemed a little odd.
Well, I think part of it is a matter of the traveler's intent. Now so many people are on Instagram, and all they want to do is basically have a picture of them with a penguin so that they could show everyone that they were in Antarctica and wasn't that cool, as opposed to really going there with the intent of learning and coming back and sharing that information, not just a picture, but actually sharing the information. So as the world becomes more accessible, there are some drawbacks to that.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I would think another place like that would be the rainforest in South America.
Exactly.
Being able to go and direct attention and get people to really understand the impact of this. I think about a place like Mauritius with sea level rise, and being able and to have them be able to go and talk about it in an informed manner with doing good. I mean, there's kind of an aspect of wellness to that.
And tourism can also bring economic benefit to some of these communities that might otherwise have to rely on selling their land or giving their land over to companies who are not working in the locals' best interest. So that idea of using tourism and building tourism, even in some of the African countries where animal poaching has been such a problem, but now the locals are realizing, look, tourists come here to see these animals. We need to protect them. And so that's an example where actually building a tourism can actually help the local community in amazing ways.
I love it. Laura, it was so exciting to have you on the podcast today. It's always fun to talk to you and kind of hear about what you're up to. I always enjoy reading your pieces. Thank you so much.
It's been my pleasure. I'll be happy to come back anytime.
Recorded live at the corner of State and Jackson, this is Dr. Nicholas Thomas. Thanks for listening to The Hospitality Spirit.